Hey, everybody. We're adding a special new feature to the podcast where you get to participate by asking a question of my guest. So here's what you're going to do click on the link below, and there you'll find the schedule of my upcoming podcast guests, and you can see who's coming up, what the topics are. And if you'd like to ask a question, just fill out the form there, send that to us, and I will read the question and your name on air and ask the question of our guest, and we'll see what they come up with. So check it out. Click on the link in the show notes. I've had on the show a bunch of episodes on religion, not just, atheism and theism and theology and all that stuff, but really more interest to me is why people believe religions. What is the origin of religion? What's the sociology, anthropology, social psychology of religion, and so on. And that's really what you do. You're not judgmental on, religions in particular, just what's the explanation? And I really like that. It's data-driven, it's theory-driven. So maybe we'll just start there. What do you mean by religion?
Okay, so in the reviews of the book, people are sometimes a little bit puzzled because I say two things about religion, and they're not sure which of these things is necessary, which is sufficient, how they relate to each other. So let me clarify what the two things are. What I define religion is as all of those activities that turn around the perception of interaction with invisible spirits, which intervene in the world, that affect our welfare, that are susceptible to our communications and may affect our welfare in ways that make us better off if we engage with them in an appropriate way. But the kinds of activities that can be involved is legion. So religion, in some sense, doesn't have an essence because it involves just an enormous range of activities, from silent individual meditation to waging war at a massive scale to singing hymns in a church to performing Bible study to engaging in rituals for the dead. In a sense, there's no essence to that. What unites it is the idea that these activities are performed in a sense of awareness that they are part of our interaction with these invisible spirits. And the second thing I say about them is that the particular way in which those activities fit together is through the notion of a platform. And a platform is like an economist's way of describing a community. Now, not all communities are platforms. The point about platforms is that they're communities that bring people together and enable people to do things together that they would not otherwise do. And, we're used to platforms in the modern digital sense. So we think about Google and we think about Facebook and we think about Instagram and so on. But platforms have been around since the dawn of history. And, in some sense, a lot of ancient marketplaces were platforms. And platforms are also the fireside where people come together. And, without the fireside, people would interact in very different ways in hunter-gatherer communities. And so platforms make these interactions possible. And of course, there are many kinds of platforms that are not religious at all, but the particular skill of religious movements is that they use the logic of platforms to bring together people in activities that involve this interaction with the invisible spirits. So the interaction with invisible spirits is a necessary condition to be a religious movement. But many religious movements are powerful because they use the logic of platforms in a way that secular organizations do as well. So there are lots of secular communities, political communities, and digital platforms and so on that have nothing to do with religion. So not all platforms are religious, and not all religious movements deploy the platform logic in particularly productive ways, but the most successful religions all do.
Yeah. I'm going to read a portion here from your introduction that I think nicely captures this. Religions, in short, are businesses. Like most businesses, they are many other things as well. They're communities, objects of inspiration or anxiety to observers from the outside, cradles of ambition and frustration to their recruits, theaters of fulfillment or despair to those who invest their lives or their savings within them. but they are legitimate businesses, a fact that should give pause to some of their detractors, like me, but also empower those, their supporters as well as their critics, who believe they should be accountable to society as other businesses are. And they need to be understood in terms of their organization as well as in terms of the mission they inherit from their founders. A convincing account of the success of businesses like Microsoft or Apple can't stop with charming stories of their teenage founders coding obsessively in their parents' garages. It's such a great sentence. It needs to understand the current structure of these businesses, their logistics, and their corporate culture. A convincing account of the success of religious movements requires no less comprehensive an investigation. And 500 pages later, we have one. By the way, I should tell you this funny little coincidence. So you probably know about the Cato Institute in the United States. It's kind of a right-wing more libertarian think tank. Anyway, I get mail from them. So I get the latest fundraising thing came with a bunch of bookmarks, right? So bookmarks with Cato Institute, individual liberty, limited government, free markets, peace. So I threw it in your book because this was when it came. Was the day I started reading your book, and then I just realized on the back they have quotes from famous economists. Adam Smith. Let me read you the quote because it's kind of funny here. There is no art which one government sooner learns of another than that of draining money from the pockets of the people. So, I mean, I guess he's talking about government taxes, right? But you would distinguish, I guess, religious tithing from government taxes.
Well, it's a spectrum. Government taxes, we don't mostly have a choice to pay, but at a margin, we do. I mean, I have chosen to live in France where taxes are quite high, but I also get very good public services. And I get healthcare that is dramatically more reliable than what many people in the United States get. And so, I guess I like France. I didn't have to live here. I was born and brought up in Britain. I have a lot of ties to France. But so a lot of my choice to live in France is voluntary at the margin. I could have chosen to live somewhere else. And paying taxes is part of that calculation. Now, many people are brought up in religious movements where there are obligations that they don't choose, but at the margin, people do have choice. That doesn't necessarily mean that they exercise the big choice of joining the movement or to quit, but they can exercise some degree of discretion at the margin about how much they invest. So tithing is only part of it. And I start the book with the story of a very young woman who pays an enormous proportion of her income, about 12%, we calculated, to a very, very rich pastor in Ghana. And what I wanted to say was that she does this lucidly. She does it knowingly. She's not a fool. Now, you may say she should be spending the money on something else, like healthcare for her aunt, or who would be a deserving destiny of those resources. But what she does is thought through, and we need to respect the thought process that has led to that, even if, say, you or I might not make that choice in her place.
Yeah, I was just thinking about taxes and tithing. One's voluntary, the other's not, is a nice distinction between how the left and right tend to think about our obligation to help people who can't help themselves, let's say social welfare transfers. One of the arguments conservatives make is that, we're not heartless people that don't care about poor people and mentally ill and addicted and people that have fallen on hard times. We just think it should be done privately through churches or, private nonprofits or whatever. And liberals tend to think, no, that's our obligation, all of us collectively, through taxes. That's what we have taxes for. And it's sort of an interesting distinction there along the lines of what you're talking about here, of how that affects how you think about it. If I give money to a charity, I feel like I'm doing something directly, and I get a kind of a little moral boost about it, like, oh, I'm a good person. I did this nice thing. Whereas with taxes, I don't feel that at all. It's just like, yeah, whatever. Okay, I guess we're all in this together.
Yeah, I guess that's right. But again, at the margin, I mean, I don't, I have an accountant who does my taxes, and I don't say to the accountant, save me every penny. I think it's fair to pay my taxes. Yeah. I say, make sure I don't end up paying ridiculous amounts more than I should. But the main thing I want to do is to ensure that I don't make mistakes and, end up not doing stuff that I ought to do. I think I actually think most uh, tax systems, including in the United States, would collapse if literally nobody ever did what they felt they ought to pay their taxes. If everybody was chiseling to the maximum at the margin, the US tax system would collapse. And we've seen this in some very interesting um, sort of experiments that have been done in which, for example, people are warned that not enough people are paying their taxes and they should do more. And this has a paradoxical effect of um, discouraging people from paying their taxes because most of us think if I know that other people are mostly paying their taxes, then I'm going to be happy to do the same thing. And I think we underestimate at our peril the basic decency of most people. Now, of course, David Hume said uh, you have to design a government for knaves. But even David Hume didn't say everybody's a knave. What David Hume said was that there are enough knaves around that you need to make government knave-proof. And in particular, you want to ensure that the tax system cannot be radically undermined by people who wish it ill. But it's still the case, I think, that most tax systems are constructed on the understanding that most people will accept to pay their taxes without trying to squeeze the tiniest dime out of it in their favor, so long as they're reassured that most other people are doing the same thing.
Yeah, I think are you referring to those game theory experiments where everybody is given a certain amount of money and then you're voluntarily put it into a pot and then the pot is doubled or 1.5 times or whatever, and then everybody gets the same division. And if it's done anonymously, the moment somebody starts to short their contribution to the common pot, and it's obvious because the overall average goes down, then everybody starts to cheat a little bit and a little bit more, and the whole thing collapses. So you need some kind of transparency. How much is everybody giving? And then some kind of punishment for those who free ride or cheat the system a little bit.
Exactly. And so long as people are reassured that most other people are doing their fair bit, then most people are very willing to do their fair bit. And they're even willing to initiate doing their fair bit at the start of an experiment before they're reassured that else is doing as well. People are not paranoidally untrusting of others in most social situations in reasonably well-ordered countries that are at peace. Now, obviously, if you're in a part of Africa where there's a civil war going on, or then you may be very unwilling to trust what some random stranger will do. But I think in countries that are reasonably well-organized and at peace, most people will assume that others are doing their bit. I mean, we see again and again in these game theory experiments that there is a subset of the population that are sociopaths that really will be maximally selfish. But it's always a minority, which is very interesting. It's very, very rare to see a game theory experiment in which everybody tries to cheat to the max. What we see is a subset of people, a minority of people will cheat, and the framework of interaction has to be robust enough that the rest who don't try to cheat all the time are reassured that they're not being taken for a ride. And then on the whole, you can get an equilibrium which is reasonably pro-social.
Yeah, I was just looking to see. Oh, yeah, you do have Christopher Baum's book in here. Yeah, I loved his research on this. That why didn't natural selection get rid of all the free riders and bullies and cheats? And the answer seems to be most groups can tolerate a small percentage, maybe 1 to 3%, and that's good enough. You don't have to get rid of every last one of them. But if it becomes like 20% or 30%, then the group collapses. So you have to have some kind of system set up. Yeah. Nice.
That's right. And I think also it's because it gets marginally more expensive to get rid of the last sociopath, because when sociopaths are rare, they're very good at hiding. Okay. So you have to really invest enormous resources to try and make sure that you flush out the very last sociopath that's hiding in your society. So most societies quite reasonably don't bother. They try to make sure that the real cheats and scoundrels and sociopaths are kept to a minority and are sufficiently afraid of what the consequences would be of trying to cheat all the time that they don't do it except on rare occasions.
Yeah, I loved his discussion of the original capital punishment in these hunter-gatherer groups where
Yeah.
this one big bad bully he just will not come around, and he is really being too disruptive to the group. So they take him on a hunt, and they come back without him.
Yeah. Have you read Richard Wrangham's book, The Goodness Paradox?
I did, yes. Yeah,
Because
yeah,
that sort of develops that and shows how that actually made a huge difference to us genetically
yeah.
as well as culturally.
Yeah, Richard was on the show talking about that. Yeah, the
Yeah.
paradox. Yeah. So, well, anyway, that's enough of that because I wanted to run another idea by you. 25 years ago, I was researching How We Believe, my book about religion, and at the time,
Which I read at the time and really enjoyed.
thank you.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Oh well. Okay. So at the time, I was the paradox to explain was how come America is such an outlier in terms of its religiosity compared to European countries. So, there were two ideas floating around. Let's just call them the free market explanation. That is, in America, the government doesn't support churches, so they have to compete with one another like businesses. So this would be along the lines of what you're proposing here as businesses, and that therefore they have to up their game and make it really relevant. Like, I don't know if you've probably been to some of these mega churches in the United States, but these services are unbelievable. I mean, it's a show. And there's, live music and singing and it's a whole, hours long, and people go there for the day, free babysitting, free parking. I mean, it's really quite the thing that you don't see in European churches. And then the other explanation was the kind of social welfare, that if the government is covering, the kind of the safety net there that religions used to do, what do you need religion for? I don't know. So what are your thoughts on those two explanations? And is
Well,
America...
I think those, yeah, those two are a big part of the story. But of course, as many people are now starting to say, well, if that's all it is, then how can we explain the decline in religiosity that seems to be coming up in the US right now? And so that's why fairly early in the book, I get into the Adam Smith theory of religious competition, which says that one of the things that can undermine it is uh, a deal that is done between religious leaders and political leaders. And basically, the more dynamic is a religious movement, the more envious political leaders become of the legitimacy that the religious leaders have acquired through their dynamic capacity to compete. And so what they do is they offer the religious leaders a deal which says, look, we're going to regulate this activity in such a way that you're going to be protected from your competitors. And in return, we want you to say nice things about us in your sermons and tell people that, the government is legitimate, or even that the emperor is a god, or whatever may be the most appropriate way of fitting that deal into the contemporary culture. And so what Smith said is that this is actually really bad in the long run, both for the politics and for the religion, but it's irresistibly tempting in the short run. And what I think we're seeing in the US is not that the competitive vigor of churches and other religious movements has dimmed, but that we're starting to see a serious change in the old understanding that the government would keep more or less out of religion. Now, it was always a little bit discussable at the margins. I mean, that the government always had a kind of establishment Protestantism to it, but the establishment Protestantism was pretty low key. And the fact that right now you have, first of all, a majority of Supreme Court justices are Catholics and clearly seem to be guided by Catholic doctrine in some of the decisions they're making that affect the well-being of their fellow citizens. The fact that Protestantism in the US has very nicely shown by a great book by David Hollinger, published a couple of years ago, that US Protestantism went from being relatively neutral in a slightly condescending establishment, old-fashioned way to becoming very politically engaged in the interwar years and then the early post-Second World War years when mainstream Protestantism became, by US standards, quite liberal, and that this sparked a reaction from people who were temperamentally more conservative, who said, we don't like the way in which our churches that we thought stood above politics are trying to push us in a more liberal direction. And the result was that they moved into the evangelical movement, which was more accepting of their kind of conservative political orientation. What we're seeing is that it's much less accepted than it was 30 or 40 years ago, that the US political system is a kind of open arena in which different religions and different churches can operate freely without the individual members of those communities being told what to do on religious grounds by an alliance of political and religious leaders. So I think that is threatening to move religiosity in the US in a more European direction, where, for several centuries, religion was associated with the conservative half of the political spectrum. And the result was that if you weren't a political conservative, you couldn't very easily be a full-throated religious believer. And I fear that, well, fear is perhaps the wrong word because I try not to be judgmental, but I suspect that if the movement towards making an alliance between right-wing politics and religion is further entrenched, this is going to give religion a kind of political spin throughout US society that will actually be very bad for its ability to command support across the political spectrum. That's not a foregone conclusion. And as I said before, if you read David Hollinger, the book's called Christianity's American Fate, and it really illustrates beautifully how, if you like, the hijacking of religion by politics is not just a right-wing thing. It was actually a liberal thing insofar as it affected mainstream Protestantism in the interwar years and the post-war years. It's not, sadly, in my book, because I came across his book too late for The Divine Economy, but I think it's a terrific book, and it really helps to understand the sort of antecedents of the connection between religion and politics in the US today.
Yeah. I had Catherine Stewart on the show. Her book is The Power Worshippers. This is about the rise of Christian nationalism. They're like, what happened to the moral majority in Reagan's in the 1980s and all that stuff? They kind of morphed into this new group that these are the sponsors of prayer breakfasts that all politicians feel they have to do. And, where the deals are made behind the scenes of, we'll get you the votes if you get us the judges we need, that kind of thing. It's sort of like, how could conservative Christians possibly support Trump? And during the Trump administration first 4 years, I asked people this because I do a lot of God debates. So I'm in these churches. How can you possibly support this guy? You're the party of morals and family values and all this stuff. I mean, look at this guy. And their answer was basically, well, first, this was before the overturning of Roe v. Wade. He's going to get us the judges we need, which he did, to do this thing we want legally and overturning Roe. And then also, God works in mysterious ways. Look at the flawed characters in the Old Testament that he used to deliver his message. And Trump's just like one of those. And, basically, and then also, of course, the pragmatic aspect. It's a two-team game, and you have to pick one team. That's our team. It doesn't matter who the leader is. I'm voting for that team.
Mm. I think that's right. It's about which community you belong to. And what was very interesting in the US for so long was that the communities were not principally defined along political lines. Now, of course, we know, and it's been true for a long time, that there's a lot of sorting in the US by, for example, where you live. Famously, there's zip code sorting for what kind of school your kids go to, but there's also zip code sorting by what kind of church you go to. So a study I cite by Raj Chetty and Matt Jackson and others using Facebook data is really interesting, because what it shows is that it compares different kinds of communities that people belong to, their their churches, but also their workplaces, their schools, and so on, and says, in which of these communities are people most likely to make connections across socioeconomic lines? That's to say, poor people are within those communities are more likely to interact with more prosperous people to the extent that they're able to become Facebook friends with them. Now, of course, you may say, well, Facebook friends, maybe it's not the same thing as real friends, but that's a matter for another discussion for another day. But and they find something very interesting, of which the first part may strike you as rather encouraging, and the second part much less so. So the first part is, it turns out that churches are the best mixers, in the sense that within churches, poor people are much more likely to interact with prosperous people, much more so than within schools, within workplaces, or within neighborhoods, etc. The bad news is that churches are much more segregated by income than these other things. So it's as though people are saying, well, when we go to church, we're going to feel obliged to interact with all sorts of people that are not in our socioeconomic comfort zone. So maybe we should pick a church where that's not going to be too much of a challenge. And so you do have a lot of segregation by socioeconomic status in churches, much more, I think, though we don't have the data, than would have been the case 30 or 40 years ago. And it's also true that segregation by politics is greater. But that said, the evidence suggests that most US churches are not ramming their politics down people's throats. I mean, a minority are, and they're the ones that we see the stories about, the pastors who are urging people to vote for one politician rather than another. But that's largely because people are sorting to churches that match their prior political convictions. But when something like completely unexpected, like the COVID pandemic came along, I found in research I cite in the book with my colleague Eva Reiber, that when this was sort of pretty much orthogonal to what people's prior political convictions were, whether you should move online or whatever, it became correlated with people's political convictions later. But when the pandemic hit, there was basically no difference between Republican areas and Democrat areas in how willing they were to go online, what they posted about on their Facebook pages for the church. They were mostly talking about, how the community can come together, how we can all ride this out, how important it is to get good medical treatment, and initially, how important it is to get vaccinated. When the whole thing became more and more politicized and divisive, then you start to see a difference. Churches in Republican areas are doing much less posting about the importance of getting vaccinated than ones in Democrat areas. But when the pandemic first hit, most churches were not engaging in major political propaganda about this. They were just doing the stuff that communities need to do, which is saying, stay safe, look after yourselves, tell us how we can help you, tell us how we can communicate with you. And I thought that was relatively encouraging to see how the churches were behaving. The ones who were standing out early in the pandemic for being very politically polarized were a very small minority.
Interesting. Yeah, I should point out, to be fair, that Democrats do this as well in their churches. Yeah. I've told this story before, where my best friend Michael Coles in the late 90s ran against Newt Gingrich in in Georgia, in the Kennesaw area of Georgia, where Newt was the representative there. And Newt was kind of at the height of his power, so Michael had, very slim chance of beating him. But I went back there to support him on the weekend before the Tuesday election. And on Sunday, we went to Martin Luther King Jr.'s church, the old church that's still there, and his name is, all over. And it was, first of all, it was quite the experience to go to an all-black church, which I'd never been. I mean, it was a show. It was, Protestant churches are so boring by comparison. Yeah. Everybody singing and up and down and holding hands and amen, brother, and they're interacting with the preacher and so on. But then toward the end, the preacher, he says, hey, by the way, we have a special guest with us today. It's Michael Coles. Our friend Michael Coles. Michael, hey, say hi to everybody. Everybody say hi to Michael. Now, Tuesday's an important day. Yeah. You know what to do. And it's like, oh, yeah. I see. Okay.
Absolutely right. And indeed, in Democrat areas, we saw a big spike in political posting around Black Lives Matter. That was a big deal. So, what I think you can conclude from this is that there's a lot of polarization in the sense that, you know, people tend to go to the churches that they're comfortable with. But what we did not see much evidence of is pastors ramming down the throats of their congregation propaganda that the congregation don't want. That seems to be much less common than I expected when we started looking at this Facebook evidence on how churches were behaving. What seemed to happen was that the community and the pastor find a way of matching what they're comfortable with in mixing politics and religion. But there seems to be very strong survey evidence that most Americans do not want religious leaders deciding their politics for them.
Interesting. That's good. Another minor point here, since you covered it in the book, on countries that actually help fund some religions, like in Germany. My wife's from Germany, so I didn't know much about this until she told me. She was baptized Catholic. She went to an all-girls Catholic school all the way through high school. And when she got her first job, they started withholding taxes and sending it to the Catholic Church. I'm like, what?
It is amazing, isn't it?
She had to opt out, right? And to opt out, she had to go down to the courthouse and fill out all this paperwork. And they said, no, okay, now you understand that after this, you can't get married in the Catholic Church. You can't get, this and that. And she goes, yeah, that's fine. And they said, but there's a lag time. For 2 more months, we're still withholding the taxes from your paycheck. She's like, wait a minute. When a contract ends, it ends for both parties. Like, well, not in this case.
Yeah. Did you like the example of Iceland, which which has the government withholding taxes for people, but is very, very unusually broad in terms of what it allows to count as a religion. So there is a religion in Iceland that is exclusively open to people who are atheists and do not like paying taxes.
Right. There's one, the humanists in Germany, they get some taxes, not as much as the Catholics and the Protestants, but they get some as well. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess fair is fair. But that would get to this point. If the government is funding religions, then they don't, at least in part, I don't know how much the Catholic Church really depends on government tax money, but then they don't have to be as motivated, or they're not as motivated to be relevant to their congregations.
That was exactly Adam Smith's point. There's this wonderfully sort of sarcastic paragraph in Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations, where Adam Smith talks about why the Church of England is having so much difficulty facing up to competition from the dissenting churches, in particular the Methodists. And lots of people were saying, oh, it's all to do with basically the Methodists are dumbing down the theology. They're producing, they're catering to the lowest common denominator. They're preaching any old garbage just to get people into their churches and so on. And Smith basically said it's not the theology, it's the incentives. And he said, look, he says, I wish I could remember the sentence exactly. He says something like, the parsons of the Church of England are frequently men of learning and elegance. And of course, you can feel the full force of his sarcasm as he says learning and elegance, because learning and elegance is what you acquire when you have a lot of spare time, because you're not really getting out there and trying to persuade the members of your community to get into the church and to get active. And he says they frequently have the qualities of gentlemen, or the qualities which commend them to gentlemen, but that basically, he said, they lack the incentives to fill the pews of their churches, which the Methodists do. And the Methodist preachers, if they couldn't fill a tent full of people, they wouldn't eat; they'd get no income. And Smith was way before his time in trying to say, look, theology is not unimportant, but look at organization. And often the theology is an outgrowth of the organization. If the religious movement feels that it needs a piece of theology in order to increase its revenues, that's what it'll do. It's not like it first becomes convinced of the theology and then it does everything it can to advance that. It is figuring out how it can speak to its public, and how it can get its public to become committed. And the theology is often the tool that it uses to do that, rather than the precursor to the way in which the religion organizes.
Yeah. Along those lines, let's go back to your definition of religion, that directly or indirectly involved interaction with invisible spirits who intervene causally in the world and who can be influenced by appropriate appeals from human subjects. Okay, then what do you make of secular Jews? Like, a lot of my scientist friends are Jewish. They're atheists, but they're Jewish. I mean, they're culturally Jewish. They historically, they have that tradition. They enjoy the high holidays and and all that stuff. Is that not religion, even though they're atheists?
Yes, that's a great question. I think it is religion, and it's religion because a lot of the stories that are told around Jewish rituals are ones that make sense in terms of the chosen people. I mean, you can't talk about the chosen people unless they're chosen by somebody. And
Yeah.
so I think that many secular Jews take part in the rituals that have a sense because of a story about um, where they came from and how the rituals came to be. And I like, by the way, you sent me that link to your great podcast with Neil van Leeuwen, whose book I didn't know, but with whose argument I'm very strongly in sympathy, as you will know from having read my chapter on belief. And it's very clear that you can have what you might think of as a kind of semi-detached attitude to the theology if the theology underpins and gives some point to the ritual, which you find very attractive on all sorts of other grounds. Now, I just reviewed a fantastic book by Robert Eisen called Jews, Judaism, and Success. And if you don't know it, I strongly recommend it to you. The subtitle is something like how Jews came to be so successful in the modern world. And he basically tackles the question, why is it that Jews are so overrepresented in by measures of economic success, scientific success, and artistic success? And he basically puts it down to the influence of rabbinical Judaism, beginning very early on in the first few centuries of the Common Era, in which he claims that that the influence of rabbinical Judaism was to put an emphasis on certain values like the value of individual autonomy, the value of scholarship for its own sake, the value of rigorous pursuit of ordered understanding of the world, that was not the source of economic or scientific or artistic success immediately, because, of course, Jews were prevented from entering into most of European society until really very late, till the late 18th or the 19th centuries. But what he says is that it provided them with this enormous stock of values that once they were allowed into European society and then North American society and so on, they could then turn to a considered and ambitious pursuit of success in these different fields. And then he says, because he's very rigorous about this, he said, but wait a minute, there's an obvious objection to this, which is that actually most of the most successful Jews in these fields were secular. And what he says is, look, of course they are, because what rabbinical Judaism did was not to give you the full package that you need, but it gave you the indispensable ingredients. But in addition to the ingredients, you then needed to take a step further. And that's exactly the argument that I think people have made for Enlightenment values. We have people like Deirdre McCloskey and Joel McKeer who talk about how Enlightenment values sort of helped European society in particular, and then North American society, to become more economically successful. But when you ask where did those Enlightenment values come from, many people, including, for example, the late Larry Siedentop, who was a good friend of mine, said actually a lot of those values were in some sense Christian in an early way, that the Christian church put emphasis on these values. And what Robert Eisen does, is to say, look, actually, the rabbis got there even earlier. and they got there in a way that was more driven by the need for survival of Judaism in a very hostile world. And of course, for nearly 2 millennia, this didn't pay off in terms of success in the wider society because Jews weren't allowed into the wider society, but it gave them the ingredients which they could then build on, going further and in many cases then turning away from their rabbinical roots, just as many of the figures of the Enlightenment were indebted to Christian values, even as they then sought to go beyond Christianity, in many cases to actually resist and to repudiate Christianity. And so that makes sense to me. You can, just as your parents are responsible for lots of things, but your parents then aren't the people who make all the choices that you make as an adult, but you could not have done the things you do as an adult without the values that your parents gave you.
Would those ingredients include, from these rabbinical traditions, rationality and reason, logic, the assumption that the universe is knowable and we can know something about it by applying these tools out of which then science emerges?
That is exactly what he claims. Now, I'm not saying that I'm completely convinced by the story, because I think there are some things he leaves out, including the fact that Jews were more urbanized than pretty well any other ethnic or religious community much earlier. And I think that urbanization provides an exercise in all of these values that is a sort of rival explanation to the education and these values that he claims were provided by rabbinical Judaism. But he does provide, I think, some pretty convincing evidence that rabbinical Judaism was, how can I put it, an important developer and promulgator of values that later became important in a kind of Jewish Enlightenment. And it's not in my bibliography because, again, it's a book that I discovered since completing The Divine Economy. But I strongly recommend it to you. And it's a sign to me of how many different researchers are, I think, converging on trying to see the influence and the behavior of religious movements in a social setting in which they're competing with each other, in which they're competing in simultaneously, not just in the belief space, but in the economic space, in the social space, in the ritual space, in all kinds of spaces. And that we can have a discussion about that without having to decide whether this or that aspect of Judaism is true, or, you and I can discuss that whether or not we agree with the particular nature of the teachings.
Yeah, I asked because a lot of Christian theologians I debate argue that science arose from these traditions that were grounded in the Judeo-Christian worldview, and that it wasn't a battle or a contest at the time during the scientific revolution, the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment, and all that stuff. I think it was didn't Rodney Stark write a book about this, the kind of the rationality behind Christianity, or Christianity giving a foundation to rationality?
Yeah, and Brian Vickers, for example, this is 30 years old now, but he has a book called something or other in the Enlightenment. I'm forgetting the title, but it basically argues that sort of scientific and what you might think of as more magical or more theological accounts of the world were much more closely intertwined during what we think of as the rise of the Enlightenment than the typical historical story allows. And I don't see it. For me, the metaphor is, what happens as people pass through different stages of their lives, that, what seems obvious to you as an adolescent is not what seems obvious to you as an adult. And by which I'm not saying religion is adolescent and science is adult. Again, some people might make that judgment. I might make it in a different setting, but I'm just saying that there are things that you do when you're young that build who you are when you're older, and you don't take the actions and do the things that are important to you when you're older using exactly the same values and tools that you had when you were younger, but the values and tools you had when you were younger may still be the necessary condition for you to act the way you do when you're older.
Yeah. And then related to that, I've been thinking a lot about different kinds of truths. This is my next book, Truth, what it is, how to find it, why it matters. And the difference between, say, empirical scientific truths, for which we use statistical methods and signal detection theory and Bayesian reasoning and all that stuff. But I think most political truths or religious truths are not in that same category. So, for example, when people like myself or Richard Dawkins say, well, the resurrection didn't really happen. And one response is, yes, it did. And here's my 500-page book with all the arguments for why the resurrection literally happened. But I think most people, that's not why they believe the resurrection happened. It's just, well, I'm a Catholic or I'm a Protestant, I'm a Christian. This is what I believe. And whether it's true or not, how would I know? I don't know much about these things. It's just what I believe. It's just kind of part of what I am as a Catholic or Protestant or whatever. And it's less important that it be literally true. So like when you, again, back to your definition, this interaction with invisible spirits, how would anybody know that there's really invisible spirits? I mean, so my point is that's less important. They're getting something, and I think this is a deeper message of your book. Those things are less important. It's this community, it's this platform that I'm getting a lot of value out of. And yeah, I think this probably happened and there's an afterlife and I'm going to heaven and Jesus will be there, whatever. But I don't know. But that's less important than the other things I'm getting.
I completely agree with that. And I just add one nuance to that, which is I think a lot of people underestimate the sheer variety within any one religious movement. Within any one movement, even if it's the Mormons or even if it's the Seventh-day Adventists or even if it's people you think of as being fairly on the niche part of the religious spectrum, you will have an enormous range of motivations of the members. And some members will really, really care about the theology. And they'll say everyone has to care about the theology. So, I mean, I have Catholic friends who really, really care about transubstantiation. And they think it's really, really important that you believe it. But the data are against them, not in terms of the truth of some transubstantiation, though that is a separate discussion. But the data are against them in terms of whether most Catholics care. Most Catholics do not care about whether transubstantiation is true. And so, although I know many Catholics who sincerely believe it's really important to believe that, and who say, you cannot be a true Catholic if you don't believe it, the data are overwhelmingly against their being typical. They are not typical. And so you have lots and lots of Catholics who transubstantiation, yeah, whatever. And that's really important. I think that the sheer variety within these movements is an intrinsic part of what makes them so vibrant and so alive. The moment they become focused on, a narrow set of theology being crucial, then sometimes they can survive in a very, very hostile environment because that's then they become cults. But if they want to be broad-based religious movements, they can't do that. And what happens is that, within the same church, you get the people who really, really think transubstantiation is important, and the people who really think it doesn't matter. And there are historical moments like the Council of Nicaea when it really, really mattered whether you were a homoousian or a homoiousian, but not because anybody had the slightest idea of how you would tell the difference, but just simply because it was who were your friends. And, if the right guys came out ahead in the council, then you would be politically powerful. If the wrong guys came out in the council, you might die. And but those are the product of particular historical political circumstances. I think that in most religious movements in countries at peace today, there's just a huge range. And the people who really care about the theology are a minority. And they're a very sincere minority, but they're not typical.
Yeah. Isn't this the point you make about marriage brokering in religions? That people going through the rituals, it doesn't really matter what the rituals are. That you're doing the rituals tells me something about your character, and that's so it's a proxy for something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is one of the things I liked most about the work that my colleagues and I did in Ghana was that we found, I think, pretty uncontrovertible evidence that many people go to church to find a marriage partner. But the crucial point about that, the twist, is that you don't go to church to find the kind of marriage partner who only goes to church to find a marriage partner. You go to church to find a marriage partner who is going to church for some other reasons. And that's why the churches can do this so well. If they were just trying to, to rival, singles bars or dating apps, it wouldn't work.
Interesting. Okay, I wanted to ask you about roughly called, let's say, the social gospel versus the prosperity gospel. There's kind of a division, at least in the United States. Christians who think our job is really to take care of the poor and man the soup kitchens and so forth, and that's what Jesus taught us. And then you have the Creflo Dollar. Do you know this guy Creflo Dollar with his $2,000 suits? God wants you to be rich.
I don't know this particular guy, but I know many other people like him. Yeah.
yeah. But so, what do you make of that division?
Well, I think they're slightly less different than they look at first sight, because having seen some, again, I start the book with this example of this young Ghanaian woman who gives 12% of her income to to a church whose pastor is incredibly rich. And she does so knowing that he is. And the prosperity gospel is a big part of the story. And it's, it's not just in the area of prosperity, it's also in health. So we're talking about communities where many people are very poor. They're also very financially insecure, which is not quite the same thing. That is to say, not just that they're earning very low incomes, but that at any moment their income can drop to zero and they have very few savings to fall back on. But the same thing is true of their health. They may be suffering from many chronic health problems, but at any one moment they could have a catastrophic health emergency and they'd have no resources in which to do it. And in those circumstances, the community offers them two things. One is a social gospel. So we should not underestimate how many of for example, the Pentecostal churches, which are based very strongly around the prosperity gospel, also have a social gospel. That is to say, if you go to the church and you fall sick, you'll be visited. And you may be able to get a loan. If you lose your job, you may be able to get some money to tide you over while you're looking for a new job. But the very interesting thing is that the prosperity gospel ties in with the social gospel, because if you've been supported by the church when you lose your job, when you get a new job, your obligation is then to tell everybody in the church about it and to make a very big donation. And so in some sense, I think we underestimate at our peril the extent to which the social gospel and the prosperity gospel sort of feed on each other. They are, both of them, compatible with an ideology that says we're all in this together, even if there are almost obscene differences in prosperity between one person in the church and another person. And the sense that we're all in this together is we look after you when things go badly, but as soon as things go well, then you really have to share the good news with everybody. And sharing the good news is not just telling everybody, it's also dipping into your wallet in a big way.
Yeah, that reminds me of Tooby and Cosmides' theory about friendship and coalitions, which are formed to even out the uneven resources of hunter-gatherers, and that you have to do sharing. And there are rituals around that to make sure that it happens equitably and so on. But it's not enough to like fake being a good friend, because we're fairly good at detecting when someone's phony. So you have to actually believe it. Like, I really, really actually do like you. And that's why I'm giving off the cues that you perceive I really like you, because I really feel that. And that's the kind of basis of true friendship and trust between people.
Yep, absolutely. And it works for, in particular, these communities so a lot of the religious movements I'm looking at are ones that are not, traditional ritual communities in villages whose population has been similar for many hundreds of years, but I'm looking at cities. I'm looking at mosques in Dar es Salaam. I'm looking at Pentecostal churches in Accra. I'm looking, at Buddhist temples in Japan or in China, and these are communities that are much larger than the kinds of forager communities that Cosmides and Tubi were thinking about. Now, the big difference is that in a forager community, we more or less know who's who. Now, that doesn't mean, as I think some rather simple pictures of forager communities would tend to make us think, that I know everything about you. I mean, I may have known you for 20 years. I have colleagues that I've known for 20 years, and I still can't quite figure out whether, if push came to shove, I could really trust them. We all have this experience. So you may interact with somebody in a certain range of circumstances, and you don't know how they behave outside that range. So there's a problem of sort of extrapolating outside the comfort zone, and you don't know whether somebody would really be trustworthy if push came to shove. So we have all of these problems of credible signaling and so on, even in communities that know each other well. But the real challenge in these, in these big cities, somebody comes looking for work from, rural Ghana to Accra. What are they going to do? I mean, they know nobody. So this question of how can they find a marriage partner, it's just the same as how can they find a job, how can they find, and also how can they find some dignity. And I think that's really important. You live a really tough life, you make all sorts of sacrifices, and for what? And you need somebody to reinforce the sense that what you're doing is worthwhile. And that's what these churches are incredibly good at doing. They're incredibly good at making people feel valued. Now you may say, okay, it comes at a high price. I mean, Pastor Shermer, you're asking me to, give you 12% of my income, and that's a very natty suit you've got on, and so on, and it's a lot. But you also know that if you just said, well, actually, I'll do your bargain basement deal, it just wouldn't make me feel valued in quite the same way.
Yeah, and I'm not sure secular institutions could ever do that. I mean, you don't work at Google or Apple or whatever to get dignity. You to make money, and you want to have meaningful work. So that's a different kind of thing, I think. There are, attempts by atheists and secularist humanists to have these ritual weekly meetings. Like the Unitarian Universalists, they meet Sunday mornings. I've been to many of their sessions, and they're atheists, but they sing hymns to Newton and Spinoza, and they have testimonials about how they lost their religion, and I don't know, they light the candle and all that stuff, and they sing certain songs. It never really did it for me, and I'm not sure it would ever catch on. I know there's movements, I think, in England as well, to build these equivalent of churches for secularists, and they've never really taken off in the same way, because I think they're offering something different than what you're talking about here.
Yes, and I think they depend on a great deal of prior affinity between the people who belong to them. One of the, I think, great competitive advantages of these large movements like Pentecostalism, but also like many of the Islamic movements that you see in Africa and in Asia, and I'm not talking about the very the Islamic movements that get much more fundamentally inclined people. I'm talking about the mass Islamic movements. Is that they're very relaxed about what you need to sign up to when you first join. There's this image that people in the West have that Islam is this incredibly fundamentalist and demanding religion and so on. But often, when you first come in through the door, it's really very laid back. You just go, you see if you like it. Somebody might offer you a mint tea or a cup of coffee, depending on and you talk, and you don't have to be serious about any one particular thing. You just have to be willing to accept that the community might have something to tell you. And I think a lot of the movements that are more secular, I mean, I wouldn't call them aggressively secular, but let's say pointedly secular. So you talk about the Unitarian churches and so on, is that it's sort of very clear what general line on things you will have to sign up to if you get serious about that. Whereas I think a lot of the large churches and mosques and so on, of course, you have to listen to a sermon about what this and that is. But a lot of the activity around you is just, it's friendly, it's people smiling at each other, it's people saying the blessing, it's singing, it's stuff that is not cognitively committing. And that's great because one thing we know about belief is that propaganda works. I mean, if you trust me, I can tell you stuff that is just crazy from the point of view of empirical verification. I can tell you that, quantum theory says, light can pass simultaneously, and, there can be a cat that's both dead and alive and so on. And you'll say, 3 bags full, Paul Seabright. Well, no, you wouldn't, because I know nothing. I'm not a physicist. But I could tell you stuff that would just seem wild. And if I had the right credentials, you'd believe it, even though there's not there's no way you could verify that or even get a sense of the intuitive reasonableness of that. And so I think a lot of religious movements, it's very similar. You go in and it's not like there's this huge sort of barrier at the door saying you can only come in if you sign up to transubstantiation and stuff like that. You don't have to. It's very relaxed. And because many people who write about religion are not very relaxed about it because they have personal experiences I think we underestimate how effective the recruitment mechanisms are, which make it relaxed, which say, okay, you've just come to Dar es Salaam from rural Tanzania. Here's a cup of mint tea. Come and join us and, see what happens.
Yeah. Well, that's what happens when you go into a Scientology office, like here in Hollywood. You're not going to hear about Xenu the Galactic Warrior and all that, that crazy stuff that L. Ron Hubbard made up. And most people that I've met that are Scientologists, they don't care about any of that. When that came out, through South Park and through the internet and so on, and I asked some people, but they're like, Xenu the Galactic, I don't know, whatever. We're helping people that are drug addicted and are alcoholics. That's exactly why I'm doing this. Oh, all right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think your book, it sounds as though you're absolutely putting your finger on something that's really important about that, which is the essential optionality of much theology. Now, some people really want to go the whole way. And this offers them a theater in which they can do that. And I use the word theater advisedly. It links up with what Neil Van Leuven was saying that, and I don't use theater disparagingly either. A lot of the most powerful experiences any of us has are in the theater in some way. And so most religious movements are very careful about giving to individuals who don't otherwise have a theater in their lives a way in which they can be in the theater, and the theology plays a part in that. But you don't have to go further into the theater than you feel comfortable with most of the time. The problem sometimes comes if you get far in and you want to come back. But that's why the way in is much smoother than the way out, as many people, including myself, who left religious movements know. But the fact that the way is sometimes very difficult on the way out sometimes makes us underestimate how comfortable it all feels on the way in.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about cults, new religious movements, how religions get started, why some succeed, why some fail. Scientology's still hanging in there. Its critics have been telling me for 25 years it's going under at any moment. Yeah, they own a lot of property. They have a lot of money invested in, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon. Mormonism is here to stay. We had a presidential candidate, Mitt Romney, who was a Mormon.
Yeah.
And, they're a pretty tight-knit group. I know a lot of Mormons here in California. They take care of each other. The whole 10% tithing thing is enforced pretty ritually. But as far as I know, there's some abuse, like there is in any organization, I guess. But, it's a tight-knit. But why did Mormonism take off back when Joseph Smith was doing his thing? There were lots of those kind of groups. What do you make of why some succeed and others don't?
Well, I think the first answer is we have to be very careful of survivor bias.
Yeah.
Because, so, I mean, if you could ask the same question about restaurants. I mean, most new restaurants fail.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think we pretty much know that what makes the difference between restaurants that succeed and restaurants fail has some system to it, but an enormous amount of luck.
Yeah.
You probably know the story of the singer Rodriguez, who he was the subject of that amazing movie called Searching for Sugar Man.
Right.
This was the guy who produced two albums in Detroit in the early 1970s, and they were complete failures. And then they found their way into South Africa, which at that time was a sort of completely cut off area culturally from the rest of the world, and he became a huge star in completely unknown to him. His records were being pirated, and he was. I mean, as in the movie, they interview people who say, no, he was bigger than Elvis. He was really a huge star, and everybody in South Africa thought he died. And then they eventually, when South Africa opened up, they discovered that here were these two parallel universes in which the same singer and the same music had completely flopped in one and completely succeeded in another. And that's a kind of parable about the way in which, a restaurant could flop in one place and succeed in another. And obviously, there's some clear things you mustn't do to maybe be successful at running a restaurant, but there's a huge amount of luck in it. And so I think the same thing is true with the religious movements. And I'm sure there are many, many religious movements lost to history, which are just as exotic and interesting as Mormonism, and they failed. And what made Mormonism succeed was, first of all, in some sense, you could say, I mean, a little bit like Christianity, almost the good luck that the charismatic leader died early enough that, before information might come to light that might make them seem less charismatic, or before they got old and tetchy and disagreeable but while some of the golden halo of their earlier achievement could then be put into good use by a really gifted entrepreneur who would take the movement to the next level. So I think that was a piece of accident that helped the Mormon church much as it helped the Christian church. In the case of the Christian church, I say this at several points in the book, the fact that it happened to appeal to women and slaves in a time and a place where women and slaves got really the rough edge of Roman morality in all sorts of ways, economically, physically, sexually. But they were nevertheless not so ground down that they didn't have some space to make their own autonomous religious decisions, meant that sort of Christianity hit that sweet spot where it was able to appeal to people who had very little autonomy, but they nevertheless had enough autonomy to make it into a movement. And, back in ancient Babylon, the people who didn't have the autonomy could not have been the public for a new movement like Christianity. And of course, much later, didn't quite have to, there were many different competing movements appealing to the downtrodden. But Christianity hit that sweet spot and took off. And obviously, once it acquired a certain momentum, the momentum itself took it forward. So there's a lot of luck, but you could also point to if the dice fall in the right way with the right, in particular, I think the crucial movement is when the first founder dies or is eclipsed or retires, what's going to happen next? And I think it's that moment that really makes a huge amount of difference. And there are, if we were to run the tape back, there are a lot of movements that would seem just as exotic as the Mormons that failed. And I wouldn't want to put a huge amount of money in advance on whether it was the Mormons that were going to succeed or those other ones. But we can look back and say, once they got, and after all, the US in the 19th century was a big place. So particularly if you could then get people on the Mormon trail, and they could come to Salt Lake City and they could organize in a way that for a while was relatively free from predation from outside. Of course, later they then came to have trials and tribulations of their own, but they could build on the um, the heroic story of the Mormon Trail, and there's a lot of evidence that people were given positions of responsibility based on either true or mythologized accounts of how brave they were on the Mormon Trail and so on. If you happen to have a movement that was sufficiently organized that you could build a common myth, I mean, myth being whether you go back to the founder myth or, importantly, the sort of the equivalent of the flight out of Egypt for the Mormons was the Mormon Trail, and the people who'd done heroic things on the Mormon Trail were then people who were given particular authority in the Mormon church as it was being built. Then I think you've got the basis for a movement that can start to respond to the modern world, including things like abandoning polygamy when it proved politically expedient to do that.
Yeah, that was Brigham Young who did all that, and that's what it takes. In the case of Scientology, David Miscavige took over after L. Ron Hubbard died.
Yeah.
Or I should say, moved on to the other plane where he is apparently still writing science fiction. I don't know if you've ever been to Scientology offices, but they all have a desk. They all have a desk with a pen and a writing pad where, in case he comes back. Yeah. Yeah, that's, I do think luck has a lot to do with it. Bart Ehrman also makes the point on the growth of Christianity. Once you get a toehold and you get a little tiny momentum, compound interest of growth takes over, and you only need like 0.5% a year or something, or some tiny amount. You don't have to convert a lot of people, right? And often try to get data from Mormons about their conversion rate. When the boys go out in their white shirts and their bicycles on their mission for 2 years, do they really convert many people? And I think the answer is it doesn't really matter. That's not why they're doing their mission. It's it's discipline, growth, and things like that, which is good. And so the two ways to grow a religion is through conversion and fecundity. I loved. Oh, by the way, I loved your section on the first the Quakers, then the Shakers, and then I had no idea there were so many groups who were celibate, and of course that's gonna hurt your future growth. But anyway, say a few things about that if you like.
Well, so I think there's an interesting set of questions about why would any religious movement want to do anything else than just have as many children as possible, given that, having children is the most effective way to bring new people into your movement. Sometimes it's because the movement finds itself in incredibly hostile and difficult circumstances, and the Shakers. I don't know enough about the history of the Shakers, so I guess I shouldn't get drawn into that. But the Skeptic movement, which I also talk about, who actually went further than the Shakers in the sense that they were not only celibate, but they didn't trust themselves to be celibate, so they removed the organs that would tempt them to break their celibacy. And I mean, these were people in an incredibly difficult, hostile environment where what they figured that they could do was to attract people through their business success and their business acumen. And this was a really strong example of the, costly signaling theory that you could prove that you're an absolutely reliable person because you've committed yourself to your business venture, which is what most of these guys were doing. I mean, it was also a religion, but it was very strongly predicated on worldly success. And you were a person who could be absolutely counted on to put in the midnight hours in the office, so to speak, but because you were not out chasing women and partying. And that, made the movement surprisingly successful for a while, but except that it didn't survive Stalinism. And, I keep talking about survivor bias. A movement may be very successful up to a point, and then the environment changes, and suddenly the things that made it successful up to that point become millstones around its neck. So I guess I'm very intrigued by the fact that, a bit like the restaurant business, and I mean, some people get a bit annoyed with me for constantly making analogies between restaurants and religious movements. But I'm very serious about restaurants. I know restaurateurs who really put their souls into it, and eating is a very profoundly. I mean, it's a very physical thing. It enters into you, and you make food for the people you love. And there are people who they're not in the restaurant business to make a fortune. They're in the restaurant business to express love, and I get that. So for me, it's not a demeaning analogy, but the restaurant business is massively diverse. It's McDonald's, it's the little corner restaurant, it's down market chains, it's up market chains, it's very local restaurants, it's franchises, it's all sorts of things, and you see all of this in religion. And that was I've constantly faced the challenge in doing this book. People would say to me, "Okay, what's the essence of religion?" And in the end, I just want to say the essence of religion is it doesn't have an essence.
Mm.
It is about community, but there are lots of other things that are communities too. So what kind of community is it? Well, it's a community that somewhere or other makes reference to invisible spirits. But as you absolutely rightly point out, with the case of many secular Jews, it's still a religion that they're doing, even though for them they don't want a part of the theology. But you still can't take part in the Seder. You still can't take part in the different rituals of Judaism without feeling profoundly moved by that story of the chosen people. And of course, if somebody says, well, who chose us and why, and is this still true? You might then equivocate. But unless that story of the chosen people matters to you, then you're not going to be part of that community. And again, I talk about Shia Islam, which shares with Christianity this astonishing feature that they celebrate the martyrdom of their founder. I mean, from the point of view of Greco-Roman religion or religion prior to that, I mean, it's just a crazy thing to do. Why would you celebrate a loser? And it was just the astonishing skill of those two movements to say, actually, our loser was only apparently a loser. He was actually ultimately the winner. And, there's some roots of that if you go back to the cult of Osiris in Egypt and so on. But what these guys did was build a story. And, to go back to the restaurant analogy again, which, I really don't mean to be demeaning. You go to many restaurants that are curated with love, and they tell you a story about themselves. They say, we moved to this place when we were a young couple, and we started our own farm, and you have farm to table, and we put our love for the land into this, and our olive oil is from our own land. And I mean, this is an origin story, and people who are good storytellers will be successful, whether they're restaurateurs or whether they're religious leaders.
It's all stories, Paul. I think we're storytellers. And I mean, every political party has a story. Things were great back when we were in power, and now they're terrible because the other guys are in power. But put us back in power and things are going to be great again. Everybody does that, right?
Yeah.
All right, let's do a slow wind up here and take a big picture look. Let's go back, think ourselves back into a twilight 10,000 years ago, as bands and tribes of hunter-gatherers began to coalesce into chiefdoms and states. You go from a few hundred people, a few dozen to a few hundred to a few thousand, 10,000, 100,000. Jared Diamond makes the point that you can't have these informal means of conflict resolution where everybody sits around the little dirt quad in the center of our little village and hash out our differences. You need some kind of structure. So we got two big things, government and religion. How do you think about how it all started? And maybe if you want to comment on the evolutionary origins of it. Is it an adaptive feature, a group selection model? Is it a byproduct of something else? Kind of give us the big picture.
Okay, so I think there are two broadly competing visions of that story. One says that a religious sensibility preceded and enabled the growth and the size of society. So there's all the literature going back to big gods and so on, Aaron Zion and his colleagues. And I have a lot of respect for that. And I think it's undeniably true that this idea of big gods, that we have sort of police in the head that make us behave pro-socially when there are not mechanisms around for our neighbors to police everything we do, I think it's descriptively true of a lot of people in large-scale societies, but the fact that it's descriptively true doesn't mean that it's the right origin story. There's an alternative origin story which says that societies got big first because creating a physical surplus which could be stored meant that the powerful members of that society would emerge from the same kind of processes that happened in hunter-gatherer societies. They were successful hunting, fighting, etc. They had greater success with women, etc. They didn't face pushback, as we see in the work of Chris Berman and others, from people jealous of their newfound leadership, because they could basically hire they could hire mercenaries to keep themselves in power. So what do you need to hire mercenaries? You just basically need enough stored grain to pay the mercenaries with. Okay, and for a lot of mercenaries, it's much nicer feeding off the stored grain that the ruler gives you than it is having to farm the stuff yourself. So then the question is, well, why is religion necessary? Well, because it's actually very expensive to build a large-scale society just on mercenaries. I mean, running a police state is incredibly resource intensive. So is there a way in which you can actually persuade people to go along with it with relatively low-scale policing? And I think the evidence for that is very strong. So there are lots of evidence, for example, on the growth of human sacrifice. I mean, I may not be inclined to believe just intrinsically in a big God, but if I have been brought shivering and terrified into a large amphitheater, and some really powerful people in my society are, decapitating my next door neighbor, and are basically telling me that this is commanded by a higher power that I can't see. I mean, I said to you before, propaganda works. I'm likely to believe that. And so I think the alternative story was that essentially coercive power preceded ideological power. And I think there's lots of research going on, and some of it using phylogenetic methods, for example, which is part of the evidence for the second story over the first, is, I think, far from conclusive. But broadly, I favor the second story over the first. But I also I quote Kim Strelny quite a lot in the chapter on evolution there. And I think Kim has a great way of showing how you can come to have the elements of a religion gradually. And I think a lot of the people, I don't include you in this, but I think some of the more, of the militant atheists sort of say, well, there had to be a moment in which you came to believe this crazy stuff, and humanity must at some point have bought into it. And what Kim is really good at doing is explaining how you can have the elements of a religious movement that gradually takes on greater momentum and greater weight. And you can imagine sort of something like Mahler's Symphony of 1,000, sort of the crescendo builds up, or the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth, that you have the build up of the religious movement, so that by the end you're buying into it. But there's no point at which you can actually say, okay, where did I start to believe in the big God? What happened was that the big society preceded the big God. And so I think I'm broadly favorable to the idea that big societies preceded big gods, but that didn't make the ideological role played by big gods unimportant. It's just that it wasn't the precondition for building the big society. It was a natural consequence of the way in which a big society, once created, could hold together, bearing in mind that it's spectacularly resource intensive to run a police state for people who really don't want to be governed by the police.
That's a great story. That's a good account. Yeah, I largely agree with that, as well as, to wrap it up, the future of religion. You've convinced me that it's not going to go away. A lot of us in this business think, well, it's the rise of the nuns. Look, it's happening finally. But your data shows that, in fact, around the world, religion's on the move in a lot of areas. Pentecostalism apparently is the fastest growing religion in the world, or Christian branch of religion
Well, it
in the
depends
world?
how you. I mean, in some sense, the Jehovah's Witnesses are faster growing because they start from a much lower base. But
I see. Yeah,
I
of
don't
course.
think I don't think it's particularly interesting to have a contest as who's growing fastest.
Yeah, yeah,
But there's a lot of fast growth there, and in particular, Christianity is not being pushed aside by Islam. That's just not happening.
yeah, yeah. And also, again, the theological matters that rationalists go on about, including me, is secondary. This is not really why they're there in the first place.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, when I do these debates about the origins of the universe and the fine tuning and all the argument, the cosmological argument, all that stuff, the average person going to church, they don't care about any of that. That's not why they're there.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. I mean, the one thing I'd say though is that it might seem as though I'm saying both, religion is going to be around forever and we should get used to the fact that's true. I should also be saying we should, however scientific or rationalist or whatever we are, we should also relax about that fact because it's not intrinsically a bad thing. But we haven't talked very much about this, and I wouldn't want your readers to go away without feeling that I do talk about some of the bad stuff. I mean, I have a whole chapter on abuse and
sex abuse,
and I think that there is, of course, abuse happens in many, many different kinds of organizations. It's not unique to religion. But I'd want to say that the crucial thing about abuse is that, yes, there are abusers who are bad people, but abuse is much more likely in some structural situations than in others. And we can think about that in a constructive way. And if we can find ways to ensure that that religions are treated as legitimate businesses, but therefore also as accountable businesses, then I think everybody's going to be better off, including members of religious movements. We don't have to see this as a zero-sum game between, the atheists and the believers. I'm just not into zero-sum in that dimension. I think we can find more constructive ways to get religious movements to live alongside secular movements.
Well, I mean, the Catholic Church has paid out hundreds of millions of dollars for sex abuse crimes, and they're still surviving. I guess, they can absorb a lot of that.
But they could do with thinking much more constructively about it's not, they're still very tied into the rotten apple theory. And I think the rotten apple theory is bullshit. I mean, the problem is that there'll be rotten apples in all over the place. The question is about the enablers. Okay. Why do some organizations have more enablers within them than others? And it's getting at the enablers rather than the rotten apples that you really have to think about. And most enablers are decent people, but they're just decent people who would rather look the other way.
Yeah. Well, that's what happened. Yeah. I was also astonished that your analysis of the structure of the Catholic Church, I thought it was way more hierarchical with multiple levels, but it's nothing like, say, Google or Apple or a giant corporation.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think people don't really realize this. There's basically only 4 layers. There's the individual believer, there's the priest, there's the bishop, there's the pope. Now, there's many more layers of status. So, if you're a deacon or an archbishop or something, but in terms of authority, I mean, the archbishops advise the pope, but basically the bishops are the ones. It's the pope is responsible to the bishops in some sense, and similarly, the priests are responsible to the bishops. And that means that this is incredibly flat. And so no pope can keep an eye on what all the bishops are doing, and no bishop can keep an eye on what all the priests are doing. And so it's been inevitable since the founding of the Catholic Church that they would have to look the other way on all sorts of things all the time. Every pope has done it. Now stuff is coming to light and people are saying, Francis did it too, and also did Benedict, and so there's no point in having a contest for which pope did it more. Every pope has turned a blind eye to abuses. Every single pope. There's no point in saying who's a good pope, who's a bad pope. We've got to look at the structure. We've got to say that if you have that flatter structure, then there's a bandwidth problem for the top levels. They cannot keep an eye on everything that's going on. So you've got to change the structure. That doesn't mean you need to have more hierarchy, but it means you need to have more countervailing power at all of these different levels. And so to go back and
would it help if priests could marry?
I don't think that's the big deal.
No.
I mean, that's not a fix. I mean, and by the way, there's just as much abuse in Protestant churches. It's coming less to light. Paradoxically, we've learned more about it in the Catholic Church because, being a centralized organization, they've realized that they need to allow inquiries and stuff like that. And so it's coming out earlier in the Catholic Church, but it's going to come out everywhere.
Oh,
and
wow.
So I don't think priestly celibacy has much. It may make a little epsilon difference at the margin, but that's not the thing. The
Yeah.
problem is the structure.
Yeah. Well, Boy Scouts. Another problem.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, last question. This is coming out of left field, completely crazy. We're about to colonize Mars. Do you think in 1,000 years there'll be religions on Mars?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if anybody tried to find a little charter planet on which, they could say the condition of coming to this charter planet is that you are not religious, it would work for the first colonizers, and then a couple of generations later, you'd find these churches starting up. I think trying to keep religion off Mars is a fool's errand. We won't do it. We could try and, help to ensure that on Mars there's a healthier relationship between the religious businesses and the other businesses and the other institutions of ordinary society.
Oh, I did forget to ask you about Islam, and that there's kind of this debate about to what extent the violence that we see in the Middle East and other hot spot areas are religiously, theologically driven, or is it really American foreign policy and we have troops here and there and it's really more political? Probably know some of this. I know you know some of this research on, they organize these terrorist cells through soccer teams and things like that, and these kids that are doing this and being recruited, they're not theologically fine-tuned to any of this. They're just joining a band of brothers that are against this evil empire, America, that sort of thing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think recruiting people for violent ends will always be easier if you can tell them a story. I make the analogy in the book between recruitment to jihadi movements and recruitment to the Crusades in the Middle Ages. And there's this really interesting analogy where I point out that Thomas Hegghammer, who's now teaching in Oxford, has done this study of jihadi literature. And one of the more interesting parts of this is these videos of the jihadis weeping. And it seems kind of strange because they're supposed to be very manly, but here are these videos showing that some of those brutal jihadis are actually very tender, and they're moved to tears by all sorts of things, by the sufferings of fellow Muslims and everything. And so one of the questions is, why did they do this? And the idea is that when you're recruiting people for something very violent, you need to tell them a story about why they're not bad people when they do that. And so you have to tell them a story about how it's linked to being tender-hearted. And the interesting thing is you go back to the Crusades and it's exactly the same thing. There's this whole literature on the Weeping Crusader. The Weeping Crusader who's, of course he has to be tough. He has to hack the heads off women and children in the Holy Land. But at the same time, he has to be moved to tenderness by, the sufferings of his fellow Christians. And so what I think we see is that religions it's a technology. It's like guns are a technology. I mean, you can use them for all sorts of ends. The guns don't kill the people kill the people, but the presence of the guns changes the options that the people have for fighting each other. Yeah. And so I basically think people are fighting each other for the same old bad reasons. They're competing over land, they're competing over access to scarce resources, including women. They're competing for status, they're competing for sexual prowess, they're competing for all of the bad old things. Yeah. And religion is just one of the technologies they use for doing this. So, I got this message from a friend in India who said, why is your book not cover the elephant in the room, which is the intrinsic violence of Islam? It's much more violent. And I said to him, have you read Leviticus 20? I mean, it's a horrible
yes, right.
chapter. The point is, Leviticus 20 is not really used in most countries as a justification for killing homosexuals, except in some countries like Uganda, where the political and social conditions make it acceptable to use that. In the fact that the violent verses in the Quran are used as justifications for killing reflects the underlying political contest that's going on, and the fact that in a political context where people have decided strategically to use violence, they reach out for the technologies available to them, which include AK-47s, and they include, suicide vests, and they include verses in whatever may happen to be their religion available to them.
Here it is, the divine economy, how religions compete for wealth, power, and people. Get it? This will inform your understanding of religion greatly. Paul, thanks so much for your work. Thanks for talking to me. Wow.
Michael,
I
it was
could
a
talk to you all
pleasure.
day about this stuff. So interesting. What are you working on next?
I've admired your work for a long time, and it's great to meet you in person. I'll be working on something about how we can induce elderly politicians to retire before dementia gets hold of them. And if you think that recent events in the Democrat Party have made that less pressing, I would beg to differ. I think the fact that most people in the Democratic Party thought that they could get the president not to run for re-election only because he might lose the election, not because it might leave us with a very old man making existential decisions about the future of the country and the planet for another 4 years, is, I think, a very worrying feature of the current situation.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm thinking about next.
Good. That's important. All right.
Thank you, Michael.